The vast plain of Gaugamela trembled under the weight of hoofbeats and the rumble of iron-rimmed wheels. Dust clouds rose high into the scorching October sky of the year 331 BC, effectively obscuring the sun. Tens of thousands of men stood ready to kill or die for the fate of the known world. The air was thick with the scent of sweat leather and anticipation as the two greatest armies of antiquity faced one another. Silence hung heavy over the lines, broken only by the nervous whinny of horses and the clatter of spears against shields. This was the moment where history would pivot on the edge of a blade. Two colossal powers had converged on this flat expanse of land in modern-day Iraq to decide who would rule Asia. On one side stood the immense multitude of the Achaemenid Empire, led by the King of Kings, Darius III. His forces stretched as far as the eye could see, a sea of linen tunics and glittering armor. On the other side stood the disciplined ranks of the Macedonian army, commanded by a young king who had never known defeat. The collision of these two forces would not merely determine the outcome of a campaign, but would shatter an ancient order and birth a new era of civilization. Alexander the Great stood at the head of his Companion Cavalry, gazing across the dusty gap at the Persian host. At only 25 years old, he had already conquered more territory than most monarchs could dream of in a lifetime. He was a student of Aristotle and a warrior born of the fierce Macedonian highlands. His ambition knew no bounds, and his tactical genius was matched only by his reckless personal courage. Alexander did not simply want to defeat the Persian Empire, he intended to swallow it whole. He believed himself the son of Zeus, and today he intended to prove his divinity through the art of war. Yet the odds stacked against the young conqueror were staggering and terrifying to behold. The Persian army outnumbered the Macedonians by a margin that would make even the bravest veteran tremble. Darius had assembled soldiers from every corner of his vast dominion, including Scythian horsemen, Indian charioteers, and the dreaded immortals. He had chosen this battlefield specifically to deploy his deadly scythed chariots, weapons designed to shear through infantry like wheat. The question on the mind of every Macedonian soldier was simple and haunting. Could a small army, however disciplined, survive against the sheer crushing weight of the Persian Empire? The journey to this decisive moment had been long and arduous for the Macedonian forces. After their victory at Issus, they had marched down the coast of the Mediterranean, securing ports and denying the Persian fleet a harbor. They had endured the grueling siege of Tyre and the long march through the Egyptian desert where Alexander was hailed as pharaoh. Now they had turned inland, crossing the Tigris and Euphrates rivers into the heart of Mesopotamia. Every step took them further from home and deeper into hostile territory. They were walking into the lion's den with no hope of retreat. Darius III had learned from his previous defeat and was determined to crush the invader once and for all. He had cleared the terrain at Gaugamela, removing rocks and bushes to create a perfect surface for his cavalry and chariots. He knew that Alexander relied on the tight formation of the phalanx and the shock of his cavalry. By widening the battlefield, Darius intended to use his superior numbers to outflank and encircle the smaller Macedonian force. It was a sound strategy, one that played to every strength of the Persian military machine. The King of Kings sat on his golden chariot, confident that numbers would prevail. As the sun began to set on the evening before the battle, a lunar eclipse cast a blood-red shadow over the moon. The Persian magi interpreted this as a foreboding omen of doom for their king, which sent ripples of fear through the camp. In the Macedonian camp, the soothsayer Aristander calmed the soldiers by declaring that the sun represented Persia and the moon represented Greece. He claimed the eclipse foretold the eclipse of the Persian power. Alexander used this interpretation to bolster the morale of his men, turning a moment of superstitious dread into a rallying cry for victory. Later that night, the veteran general Parmenion approached Alexander with a proposal to attack the Persians under the cover of darkness. He argued that the sheer size of the Persian host would be terrifying to the men in broad daylight. A night attack would negate the Persian numerical advantage and sow confusion in their ranks. It was a prudent suggestion from a man who had served Alexander's father Philip with distinction. Alexander, however, rejected the plan immediately. He famously replied, "I do not steal victory." He wanted to defeat Darius in open battle so that no one could ever question his supremacy. The morning of October 1st dawned bright and hot, revealing the full scale of the Persian deployment. Darius had arranged his line with the cavalry on the wings and the infantry in the center. In front of his line, he placed 15 elephants and 200 scythed chariots. The sheer width of the Persian front meant that they overlapped the Macedonian line on both sides. Alexander knew that if he allowed his army to be flanked, it would be a slaughter. He had to devise a tactic that would neutralize the Persian numbers and strike at the heart of their command. Alexander deployed his troops in a unique formation to counter the threat of encirclement. He placed his veteran phalanx in the center armed with their 18-foot-long sarissa pikes. On the right wing, he took command of the Companion Cavalry, the elite strike force of his army. On the left wing, he placed the Thessalian Cavalry under the command of Parmenion. Crucially, he held a second line of infantry in reserve with orders to turn and face the rear if they were attacked from behind. This formation essentially created a hollow square capable of fighting in any direction. The battle began with Alexander leading his Companion Cavalry in a slow march toward the right. He moved parallel to the Persian line, drifting toward the edge of the prepared battlefield. Darius, fearing that Alexander would move off the ground cleared for the chariots, ordered his left-wing cavalry to ride parallel and block them. This movement stretched the Persian line even thinner as they tried to keep pace with the Macedonian king. Alexander continued to extend his line, teasing the Persians and drawing them further away from their center. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. Seeing the Macedonians moving toward the rough ground, Darius ordered his scythed chariots to charge. The drivers whipped their horses into a frenzy, and the heavy vehicles thundered toward the Macedonian phalanx. Sharp blades extended from the wheel hubs, spinning with deadly speed. The purpose of these chariots was to break the formation of the infantry and create panic. As they approached, the ground shook and the noise was deafening. It seemed impossible that foot soldiers could stand their ground against such a terrifying mechanical onslaught. But the Macedonians were disciplined, and they had drilled for this exact scenario. As the chariots approached, the phalangists calmly opened lanes within their ranks. The horses instinctively ran through the open gaps rather than crashing into the wall of pikes. As the chariots passed through the rear ranks of the Macedonian infantry, struck the drivers and horses with javelins. The terrifying charge that was meant to shatter the Macedonian line ended in disaster for the Persians. The chariots were neutralized with minimal loss to Alexander's forces. With the chariots defeated, the Persian cavalry on the left wing charged to halt Alexander's movement to the right. A fierce cavalry battle erupted on the edge of the battlefield. Dust swirled as horsemen clashed with spear and sword. The Persians fought bravely, and their numbers began to tell, pushing the Macedonians back. However, this engagement was exactly what Alexander had hoped for. By committing so many reserves to the flank, Darius had weakened his center. The Persian line had stretched too far, and a gap was beginning to open. Alexander, commanding from the front, spotted the weakness he had been waiting for. The movement of the Persian left wing had created a break in the line between their center and their flank. This was the decisive moment. Alexander ordered his Companion Cavalry to form a giant wedge. He wheeled his horse Bucephalus around and led the charge directly into the gap. Behind him came the battalions of the phalanx marching in echelon. The wedge struck the Persian center like a thunderbolt, aiming straight for King Darius. The force of the Macedonian charge was irresistible. The Companion Cavalry, armed with their Xyston lances, smashed into the Persian guards. Alexander fought with the fury of a man possessed, hacking his way toward the royal chariot. The long pikes of the phalanx, following close behind, pushed into the faces of the Persian infantry. The psychological impact of seeing the Macedonian king charging straight at them was devastating. The Persian center began to buckle under the intense pressure of the assault. Darius, standing in his chariot, witnessed the collapse of his royal guard. He saw Alexander closing in, his eyes burning with intensity. The King of Kings realized that his life was in immediate danger. Panic seized him. Instead of rallying his men, Darius turned his chariot around and fled the battlefield. The sight of their king fleeing sent a shockwave of despair through the Persian ranks. The center of the Persian army disintegrated as soldiers threw down their weapons and ran for their lives. However, the battle was not yet won for the Macedonians. While Alexander was routing the center, his left wing under Parmenion was in a desperate crisis. The Persian right wing, commanded by the capable general Mazius, had hammered the Thessalian cavalry. They were outnumbered and being pushed back toward their own camp. Parmenion sent a desperate messenger to Alexander pleading for aid. The Macedonian army was on the verge of being split in two, with one half victorious and the other half annihilated. Alexander received the message in the heat of his pursuit of Darius. He faced an agonizing choice. If he continued to chase Darius, he could end the war by capturing or killing the Persian king. But if he did so, his left wing would likely be destroyed and his army lost. Alexander chose to save his men. He abandoned the pursuit of the prize he coveted most and turned his cavalry back to strike the Persian right wing. It was a decision that showcased his loyalty to his soldiers over his personal glory. The Companion Cavalry crashed into the flank of the Persian right wing, which was already engaged with Parmenion. The Persians, caught between the Thessalians and Alexander's companions, fought fiercely. This was the bloodiest fighting of the day. The most elite Persian horsemen, knowing they were cut off, fought to the death. 60 of Alexander's companions fell in the engagement, a heavy toll for the elite unit. But the arrival of the king broke the Persian resistance. Realizing their center had collapsed and their king had fled, Mazius and his men finally broke and ran. The sun began to set over a field of carnage. The dust settled to reveal the magnitude of the Macedonian victory. Thousands of Persian bodies littered the plain, while the Macedonian losses were surprisingly light. The grand army of the Persian Empire had ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. Alexander was the master of the battlefield. The air was filled with the cheers of the victors and the groans of the dying. The prophecy of the eclipse had come true. The moon of Persia had been eclipsed by the sun of Macedon. Alexander did not rest on his laurels. He immediately ordered a pursuit of the fleeing Persians, hoping to catch Darius before he could regroup. The Macedonians marched through the night, reaching the city of Arbela the next day. They found Darius's chariot, his bow, and his spear, but the king himself had escaped into the mountains. Although Darius remained free, his authority was shattered. He was a fugitive in his own empire, running from a relentless predator who would never stop hunting him. The victory at Gaugamela opened the gates of the Persian Empire to Alexander. Babylon, the great city of wonders, surrendered without a fight. The priests of Marduk welcomed Alexander as a liberator and a legitimate king. He ordered the restoration of temples that the Persians had destroyed, showing respect for local customs and religion. This policy of integration would become a hallmark of his rule as he sought to unite the cultures of East and West. The wealth of Babylon flowed into the Macedonian coffers, funding further conquests. From Babylon, Alexander marched to Susa and then to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire. It was here that he made a symbolic statement that echoed through history. After a night of drinking, the Macedonians set fire to the magnificent palace of Xerxes. The flames consumed the cedar beams and the stone columns crashed to the ground. It was an act of revenge for the Persian burning of Athens 150 years earlier. The destruction of Persepolis signaled the final end of the old Persian order. The Battle of Gaugamela was more than just a military victory, it was a cultural turning point. It marked the end of 2 centuries of Persian dominance in the Near East. The Achaemenid Empire, which had ruled from the Balkans to the Indus River, was effectively dismantled. In its place rose a new Hellenistic world where Greek language, art, and culture would blend with the traditions of the East. Cities named Alexandria would spring up across Asia, becoming centers of learning and trade. Alexander's tactical brilliance at Gaugamela is still studied in military academies today. His use of the oblique or his coordination of infantry and cavalry and his ability to read the flow of battle were unmatched. He demonstrated that a smaller disciplined force could defeat a massive army through superior maneuver and leadership. He took a calculated risk by creating a gap in his own line to lure the enemy in and then struck with surgical precision. It was a masterpiece of military art. However, the victory also marked a change in Alexander himself. As he absorbed the Persian Empire, he began to adopt Persian dress and court customs. He demanded that his subjects perform proskenses, a ritual bowing that Greeks found degrading. This led to growing tension between the king and his Macedonian veterans, who felt he was becoming too much like the despots they had fought to overthrow. The young warrior king was slowly transforming into an oriental monarch, isolated by his own power. The pursuit of Darius continued for months, ending tragically on a lonely road in the east. Alexander found the Persian king dying betrayed and stabbed by his own satrap Bessus. Alexander covered the body with his own cloak and ordered a royal funeral for his fallen rival. He hunted down the assassins and punished them brutally. By avenging Darius, Alexander positioned himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid throne. He was now the Lord of Asia. The legacy of Gaugamela extended far beyond the life of Alexander. The spread of Greek culture facilitated by his conquests laid the groundwork for the Roman Empire and the spread of Christianity centuries later. The exchange of ideas between East and West sparked advancements in science, philosophy, and art. The Silk Road trade routes were opened, connecting the Mediterranean world with India and China. The world had become a smaller, more interconnected place. Yet the cost of this new world was paid in blood. The wars of Alexander and his successors devastated entire regions and displaced countless people. The glorious narrative of the young hero often overlooks the suffering of the common soldiers and the civilians caught in his path. Gaugamela was a triumph of military genius, but it was also a slaughterhouse. It serves as a stark reminder that the course of history is often decided by violence and the ambition of a single individual. As we look back at the dusty plain of Gaugamela, we see the fragility of empires. The Achaemenid Empire seemed eternal, invincible, and divinely ordained, yet it crumbled in a single afternoon. It teaches us that no power is absolute and that hubris often precedes a fall. Darius believed his numbers guaranteed victory, while Alexander believed his destiny guaranteed it. In the end, it was the will to act and the courage to seize the moment that decided the fate of nations. Alexander would go on to march as far as India, pushing his men to the breaking point. He would never return to his homeland of Macedonia. He died in Babylon at the age of 32, leaving behind a vast empire and a power vacuum that would lead to decades of war. But on that hot October day at Gaugamela, he was at the zenith of his power. He was the invincible god-king who had toppled a giant. He had answered the question of whether the West could conquer the East. Today the battlefield is silent, lost to the shifting sands of time. But the echo of that collision still resonates. We still speak of the phalanx and the cavalry charge. We still study the mind of the man who looked at a horizon filled with enemies and saw only victory. The Battle of Gaugamela remains one of the few events in human history that can truly be called decisive. It was the day the world changed forever. The story of Alexander and Gaugamela is a testament to the impact of human agency on history. It was not geography or economics that decided the outcome, but the decisions made by two men under extreme pressure. One chose to flee and save his life, losing his empire. The other chose to charge and risk his life, gaining the world. It is a timeless lesson in leadership, courage, and the ruthless nature of power. In the end, Alexander the Great remains an enigma. Was he a visionary unifier of mankind or a bloodthirsty tyrant? Perhaps he was both. But at Gaugamela, he was simply the greatest warrior of his age, fighting for his place in eternity. As the dust settled over the Persian dead, a new chapter of human history began, written in Greek and sealed with the sword. The whisper of time still carries the roar of that battle, reminding us that history is made by those who dare to conquer.